Hey, welcome to part 2. This one's going to focus on actually implementing the branching dialogue system, and that requires kind of a few different moving parts. So kind of the first part of this video is going to focus on setting up some scripts and basically our little pieces that will make the actual implementation of the branching dialogue a lot easier, and it will be very, very easy to use and actually put in your game once you have all this stuff. So yeah, good luck! Okay, so now we're moving on to the section where we talk about how we're going to make the text boxes, where we're going to keep the text in our game, how we're going to do our best to organize it, and how to actually link the text boxes together, which is how we will make branching dialogue. Let's go over here and create a new script so we can make some custom functions. We're going to end up making quite a bit of functions over the course of this video, but it will make actually generating our text boxes and setting everything up much easier and just more fun overall to implement. So let's call this first thing we're going to do, we're just going to call it script text. And this function will be for adding in the actual pages of text. So let's write in our first parameter that we want to have, and that's just going to be the text as a string. So you could say at param, it's 3 forward slashes, space, at param for parameter, and then whatever you want it to show up on the bottom of the screen whenever you highlight it like a normal function. So let's just say like place meeting, right? If you click on this, it shows you the parameters down here. For our custom functions, we can add our own. So let's say this first one is just going to be text, or you could write string, whatever. So that will be the first argument we input. So let's add this in here as a local variable, and we just need to put underscore text, and it fills out as a local variable on its own, and this will return that first argument that we're putting in. So we're about to see how that page number variable can be super useful. When we set up our text boxes, you know that we have our array here that starts with text 0, and then it can go into text 1, text 2, text 3 for an indefinite amount. We're going to be calling this script text at the create event of a new text box. So something we can do is we can say text page number, since it starts at 0, and then we will say equals this argument text. So the first time we put script text, this will be text 0 equals text, and then right under this we can just add to the page number like this. So when we're creating a new text box, instead of having to say text 0, text 1, text 2, we can just say script text, and then down here you see we just need to pass through whatever our line of dialogue is, so we'll just say first line of text. Then this will be set as text 0. Then if we put another one under it, now our page number has been added from this first one, so now page number equals 1. And so now this is very simply dynamically adding our lines of text that we want to have. Once again, it's not doing much right now. It is very, very useful for if you have a lot of lines of text and maybe you just want to get rid of one, or maybe you want to add in another one somewhere in the middle, and that way you're not having to go back and change it from text 0, text 1, text 2, and you're not having to change all those. So it's really useful for that, but also when we start adding more interesting stuff, we'll be able to add more arguments here to make our text boxes much more interesting and expressive. So let's get rid of that, and I can actually show that to you really quick. So if I open my object text box, I'm going to set all of these back to nothing. I'm going to go back into my room really quick, open up, this is my text box object right here. So I'm going to go into the create event and just add some of these in. Okay, so I just threw a couple of these into the create event of a text box object, and let's run it. And you see that it just works. Just doing it this way, I could like cut these out, put them out of order, and this will work just as well. You can see how if I did it this way, if I wanted to move anything around, I would have to change both of these. And if you have a bunch of lines of dialogue, this is just a massive amount of wasted time. So let's create an object that will let us dynamically create a text box, like how you would do in most games. So first, let's get our text box out of the room. Oh, and I didn't rename our script. So we can call this script text box functions. Very nice. So now let's create a sprite and a new object. Let's make a really, really simple sprite. We'll call it sprite speak block. And I just made it a very simple 16 by 16 square. Make sure the collision mask is full, and that's all we need. So now let's create our object speak block. I'm going to assign the sprite and add a step event. So for this little tester, all we want is for a text box to be created whenever we click on it. So to do that, we can say if position meeting mouse X, mouse Y with our ID, so with this object, and mouse check button pressed, we can say MB underscore left for mouse button left. Then that means we are hovering over the object and we clicked on it. Then we can run some code. And what we want to do is create a text box object and run some creation code in it. So first let's just say instance create depth. Doesn't matter where, so we can just say 0, 0. Put the depth very high so it shows up on top. And then create our object text box. And if we ran the game right now, it would just create a blank text box and that's it. So to run some creation code with this immediately, instance create functions always return the ID of the new instance of the object that you're creating. So we can use with, put this in parentheses. So now we're telling GameMaker to do something with this new object, to run some code for it. Let's open up our brackets. And now we're basically running more creation code. So we could add in our text function. So you can add as many of these as you want, obviously. Let's see how that works. So let's go ahead and put our speak block in our instance layer. We can run the game. And if we click on this, yep, it should make a new text box. Very nice. Now, for now, this is just for testing's sake. Obviously, if you keep clicking on this, it'll keep making a bunch of these. If you want to avoid that, you could just add another and in here and say and not instance exists, a text box. But this is just for testing right now. So that all works fine. If it doesn't, just make sure you've copied all this right. Now we're getting closer to what we really want, except the issue here is now, how do we make the text boxes say different things? Say I had like 5 of these in a room, and I wanted them to all be something different. We can imagine this is like a point and click thing, and say these are all different objects that you want to have different text, but they're all running this same code. Not only do we not want to make an individual object for every single thing in the entire game, that all has the script basically cut up between hundreds and hundreds of objects. We want to be able to keep the script as together as possible so that way editing it is reasonable. So now we're introducing a new script, and that is going to actually be the game script. So I'm going to keep this separate than our text box functions, and I'm just going to make a new one. And we could call this script game text or game script. This is where you're probably going to keep most of the dialogue in your game. We have script game text, and we're just going to pass one little piece of information through it. And we will call that parameter. We will call it our text ID. So we can add that here as a local variable again. Now this almost certainly is not the most efficient way to do this in the world, or the most big brain programmer thing in the world. But this is kind of just the way that I figured it out, and it helps me keep everything very together. I like the way this works out. If you can find another way to do it that works better for you, by all means, you are more than welcome. But for this video, this is how I'm going to do it. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up a switch statement, and we're going to pass through our text ID. So now we're going to open it up, and this helps me keep really organized where the cases are going to be named strings. So let's open up a blank string here, tab this out, and break it. I've explained switch statements before, but if you need a quick rundown, a switch statement is basically like a bunch of if conditions. So in this switch statement, I could have the case of NPC1, I could put NPC2, NPC3, and basically this just says if text ID equals NPC1, then we can run this code in here. Now using strings for me is really beneficial because I don't have to set it anywhere else. I can just set it right here in this script. I can add whatever script text I want, and then the only other time I have to reference this is whenever I set it in an object. And you'll see what I mean. So let's go ahead and say, hi, I'm NPC1. Then we can just add a couple more lines of garbage or whatever. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for NPC2. And we'll say, hi, I'm NPC2, and then we'll switch these. So this is how we're going to do this. Let's go back to our speak block and add a creation event. we will make a variable called text ID with no underscore, and we'll default it to nothing. Then in our step event, instead of running these individual script texts, we can just run our script game text, and then we want to pass in this value. And before we do that, you need to be a little bit careful, since here, between these brackets, we are actually working inside of this new object text box, as opposed to this object speak block. So we need to make sure we are grabbing this object's variable. One way we can do that, at the top here, we can set a local variable, var underscore s, and we'll say that equals our ID, so s for self. Then we can just reference that here. We'll say underscore s dot text ID. So now we're inside the new instance of the object text box. Then we're referencing back our speak block object and getting the text ID here. And we do it this way because now that means that we can set this variable in the create event of the individual instances. So for this one, let's say we want our text ID to be NPC1. So now whenever we click on this, it should give us these lines of dialogue, and all the other ones should do nothing right now. They should basically just make an empty text box because they're not passing any of this information in, so it doesn't add any of these lines of text. So let's test that. Okay, so if I click this one, nothing, this one, nothing, 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 and there we go. So now the only thing that you need to do whenever you're setting up these types of objects, like maybe little NPCs or stuff you can interact with, you only have to put one little line here. And you don't have to initialize this string or anything anywhere else. The only two places you have to reference it are in the actual game text itself and then in the objects over here. So the reason I showed you how to do all that right now is because this system is pretty necessary for the way that my options and linking text boxes together work. So we could simplify it just one step further actually and make another little function. We can go into our script text box functions and create a new one. So we'll say function. We'll call this create text box. Put that there, open up these, and this parameter here, we're just going to call text ID. Do the same thing here again, create a local variable for that text ID argument. And then we're going to do exactly what we did here, but we're just going to simplify this out so whenever we do this later in any other object, we can just use that one single function. So I am actually going to cut this, go into our new create text box function, paste it, and now we actually don't need any of this because we'll be passing the argument in directly from the object we're calling it from. So we just need to pass this new argument in just like that. It'll do the same thing. We can go to our object speak block and say create text box. And then we just need to pass in our text ID. We don't need this anymore either. So now we can very, very simply create a new text box by just passing in one of these values right here in our script game text. I can even space these out even more because you're probably going to have a lot of lines in here, and it's nice to just see exactly where they are. You can comment any of these out how you want to, do whatever you want to do. Anything that helps you keep track, comment it out by areas, rooms in your game, whatever. So, like I said, it may seem like we went off on a little bit of a tangent there, since I said we were basically just about to go immediately into the options, but that is a really important part to making sure our options are working properly and very cleanly. So I'm just going to go ahead and clear out my workspace totally, open up a new one, close this room for now, and we can get back into our object text box finally. So since we have our new script text, one of the first things we can do is we can just get rid of this page number line right here, because now we're always going to be adding our text with that script text over here, and it is always keeping track of our page number and adding to it. So this is a completely redundant line and we don't need it, so we can just go ahead and get rid of it. So now is the time to start setting our options. So I'm going to squeeze a little subsection here and just call it options. We're going to need a few different variables here. The first one is going to be the option itself, so the text that shows up. So we'll make an array just called option, and it will be a string. It will be responses, yes and no's, can be full sentences, anything like that. Then we're going to make something called option link ID. This will also be an array. We're going to set it to -1. basically just a nothing value. Whenever we eventually set these, we will be setting them to strings because these are going to be like the text IDs, and every option is going to have a link ID with it. So if, say, NPC1 asked a question, and we added options on the bottom, just a yes or no, the option itself would just be the string yes, and then the link ID might look like NPC1 yes, to keep track of the conversation and which answer you gave. So I'll show you that in practice in a second if it sounds a little bit confusing, but just know that that's what those two separate things are, and that's why there will always be both of these. So we also want to keep track of our option position, so we can scroll up and down on our options. We'll start that at 0, and exactly like page number, we want an option number, so we can never go outside of that range, and just like page number, it will be handled in a script similar to script text. So we can go ahead and create a new function, and I'm going to call it script options, or script option. So this will be a script where we can add the actual option text and its ID together. So we need two parameters here. So param1 will just be the option, so, or you could also call it text, whatever, and the param2 will be the link ID. So we have option and link ID. Two arguments always go into this one, and we're going to do it just like we did with page number. So we'll say option of option number equals our option text, so our first argument. We'll do the same for option link ID of option number equals our link ID, and then we're going to add to option number exactly how we did with the page number. We're obviously not using these yet, but I'll just go ahead and show you what it looks like if we were to use it in game text. So if our NPC1 was asking a question at the end, we could add script option, and for our first argument, we could have our first response. So you could just say, yeah, I love video games. And then we would put in the ID that we want to go to, so the next text box that we immediately want to link to. So we could call that NPC1, and then we'll say yes. And then we could just have a nah option, and we could say NPC1 no. Then we just need to create these separately. And normally if they're branching dialogue, I will put them directly under and tab them out from where the dialogue begins. So this is where I would put the case for NPC yes and no. Sort of like this. And then we can put whatever text we want the response to be in here. And we'll just have them freak out if you say yes, and freak out even more if you say no. So that's kind of how this would work out. Might take a little bit of getting used to, but for me it works pretty well. So anyways, we haven't programmed any of this stuff to actually happen yet. This is just what it will look like implementing it once we're done. So now let's get back over to the programming side. So back into our text box. So what we want to do is we want the options to show up once we're at the end of our text box and we're on the last page and it's fully typed out. We want to be able to scroll through them, and then we want to be able to click on one of them and it to take us to whatever the appropriate response is. So first, let's just get the visuals on screen. So back into our draw event, I'm going to close a bunch of this stuff. Okay, so we want to put it about here, right around where we're actually drawing the text box. So let's add this and call it options. Now, like we said, we want our options to pop up once we're on the last page of our dialogue and that page has already filled out with all of its text. So that means we should only run this code if our drawchar is equal to our text length of the page and our current page is equal to page number -1, which means we're on the final page. I already explained why this is -1. So yeah, now we can do whatever this code is going to be if those circumstances are true. So the way I do this in Rosa Starcross is once the text is done playing, just a few more boxes show up above it with all of your options in them. So I'm going to set up a loop really quick with some variables that I sort of messed around with their values that I like for the font that I have, the background that I have, all that stuff. This is getting into the territory where you are going to have to start kind of experimenting with your own values and stuff. If you're following this pretty closely, what I have will probably work out pretty well for you, but I'll explain what all of it is so you're well equipped to try things out yourself and mess around with values. Okay, so I've set up my loop. This local variable op space is for the vertical distance between the options, and then our op border is similar to what our border variable is going to do, which is just making sure that the text is not completely pressed up against the walls of our new little boxes. And then this is just a regular for loop, looping through all the options. I called this local variable op for options, and it's looping through up to our option number. So first we want to draw the little box for the text to go over. So we'll say the option box. And because our responses could be any length, so this could be yeah, or it could be yeah, I love video games, because they can change horizontally like this, like they can get wider, we want to dynamically find that. And that's pretty easy to do. So let's make a new local variable. I'm going to call this var underscore o underscore w for option width. And we can set that to string width. Now this will return the width in pixels that our string is. And the string that we are going to be measuring is the option that we're looping through. So we will say option op. So on the first loop, when option is 0, we'll be getting the string width of option 0. So we want the width to be that size, but we also, like I said, don't want it touching. So we need to add the borders back in on the left and the right. So that would just be plus our op board times 2. So now we can just draw a little box there. So let's do a draw sprite extended, and it's going to be very similar to what we do down here. So we're going to use our text box sprite. So text b spr. We can use that same text box image there. And now that we're going to be using these x and y coordinates as references again, that'll be 3 different places we're going to be using it. And we're going to be using it again at some point. So it's probably best to actually store these in some local variables, I think. So first, I'm actually going to take this whole section, this whole options section, and put it in between here. We're going to put it right after we're drawing the background for the main big box. So I'm going to Control X to cut this, and then I'm going to paste it in this space down here. And under our draw the text box, I'm going to create some new local variables. So I'm going to call this var underscore text b x, and we will set that equal to this right here. And then I'm going to say var underscore text b y, and that will just equal our text box y. So let's plug those back in where they need to go. So first the back of the text box here, change this, and we had it down here. Now remember, we want to keep this plus border, so let's just replace the part that we have set up here, and we'll do the same with the text box y. Just replace the text box y as you see down here. Remember to keep that border. That way we're also just making sure we don't have lines of code that are like a mile off the screen. So we want to use these again with our new options. So again, we're drawing the option box, the little background. Starting with our x value here, we're using this new text box x local variable, but I actually want to scoot it over a little bit because ultimately I want to put an arrow next to the selected option. So I want to have a little bit of space. I don't want it to line up completely flush. So basically I don't want my options to line up this way. I kind of want them to be off a little bit so I can put a little marker here. That's kind of what I like. At this point, you can do it however you want to do. Just know that that's why I'm doing some of this stuff like this. So I'm going to scoot it over 16 pixels, and that's what I like. Then we're going to set our new y to the text b y, and because our options are showing up on top of the text box, we want to make sure we draw them in the right order, and we draw them spaced out from each other. So the initial place we're going to draw the box, we're going to subtract our option space times our option number. So for example, something like this, if we were to have 3 options, we're taking our y coordinate that we would normally be drawing the text box, and then we're starting by subtracting the option space, so 15 pixels times the number of options we have. So we're starting minus 15, minus 15, minus 15. We're starting here, and then we're going to start drawing them back down. That way it shows up in the order that we choose to write the options in. So we're starting from here, and then we want to space them back out going downwards. So then we're going to add option space, and we're going to multiply that times the loop that we're on. So in the first loop where op is equal to 0, it's just drawing it up here. Then when option is equal to 1, we're adding 15 back again. Then when option is equal to 2, we're adding 15 back again. So all that's good. Now we just need to get our scales. The width is easy. We're just taking that new width that we found, our option width, and we are doing the same thing we did before. So dividing it by the width of our text box sprite. So it's the correct amount of pixels. And then for height, we just want a little bit of space in between each one of these. And in my notes, it looks like 1 pixel of space was good for me. So what I did was we take that option space local variable, we just subtract a pixel from it so the edges of the text boxes aren't touching each other. And then we do the same thing, divide that by our text box sprite height. Set our rotation to 0, our color to C white, and our alpha to 1, or whatever you want to set those to. Rotation will probably give you some pretty messy results if you mess with that too much, so if you're going to change them, just stick to these two. So there's the box. Now let's actually draw the option text. So down here we'll say the option text. Oops. And this is pretty easy. Let's just go to draw text. We're going to do the same principle as here. So take our text be X, add our 16, and then we're going to do like what we did down here and add back in a border, and we're adding this option border that we set. So plus underscore op board, then kind of follow suit with the Y. We want to take the same Y position. I'm just going to copy all this. So we're taking the exact same Y position, except again, we want to have a little bit of space so it's not touching the edges. And I just chose 2 pixels for this, since having it as 4 pixels, since if I use this, it will be quite a chunky little box there. So again, this is just going to be you tweaking stuff, figuring it out however you want with your art style, any of that kind of stuff. And then now the text we want to draw is just the option that we are looping through. Okay, so that should draw all of it. So if you haven't yet, go into your game text and add some options in. Now, we can't scroll through the options yet, and clicking them won't do anything, but let's just make sure that they're drawing properly. And to make sure to do that, you do have to add some options. So let's run the game. Okay, so here we are. I cleared everyone out except for this guy. So whenever I click this, it makes this thing. And once we get to the end, we have some options. Nice. That looks a little goofy without some of the other visuals, but we got it working. And if you don't like the way this looks, then you can change whatever you want about it. We're just here to get the principles. So back to our object text box. Now we want to be able to select through our options. Programming wise, that couldn't be easier. Let's go to option selection, and we want to now manipulate our option pause variable. Super easy way to do that would be to say option pause plus equals 2 different keyboard values. So we could say keyboard check pressed down, so VK down, minus keyboard check pressed VK up. If you watched the RPG tutorial series or the menu box system video, you know why this works. And if you don't, I'm pretty impressed that you got this far in this video, but you might want to go back and watch one of those. So now I'm just gonna clamp this value like we did earlier, so it can't go out of range. So we're clamping itself, we're clamping it to 0, and to our number of options, -1. Once again, for reasons explained earlier with how arrays work and how they count, -1 is going to be the highest array value. Now this means that you can't go out of range, but you could also set this up to where it loops around, and you could just say if option pause is greater than option number -1, you could set option pause back to 0, and if option pause is less than 0, then you could set it to option number -1. But normally if you don't have a lot of options, it really doesn't make a difference. And sometimes it can kind of help with the clarity to not have it loop all the way down. Maybe your option selection is just a colored word, and if you're just looping between 2 different options, some people might not be able to tell which option is actually selected. So that's something to keep in mind. But anyways, programming wise, the option is now selected, but we need a visual indicator for it. And like I said, I want to make a little arrow. So I'm going to make an arrow sprite that's the same height as our option space really quick. So I'm going to create the sprite, open it up. I'm going to set it to 15 by 15, and then I'm just going to center it. So I might do like a black outline arrow like this. And I'll close it up like that. I'll name it SPR text box arrow. You could also do like a Square Enix style, like pointing finger or something like that. And I'm going to keep it in this top left. because I want this to just line up with the top of my highest selected option. So I'm going to go back to my text box, and we're going to draw the arrow. And we only want to draw the arrow on the selected option. And the way we could do that is by saying if our option pause is equal to op, then we can draw it. This works because in this loop, we're going through every single option, which means that if the loop that we're on is the same as our option position, then that means that is the selected option that we are on. If option pause is 1 and we are on the 1 loop, then that means we can draw our arrow. So let's say draw sprite. I'm going to say sprite text box arrow. Just draw the first subimage. And then for the X, we actually just want this one to line up with the end of the normal text box, since we gave ourselves that space here. And then we want it to draw at the exact same Y position. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it. And that should give us what we're looking for. Yeah, look at that. Nice. Very, very nice. So now we can select our options, and we have a visual indicator that we are doing so. The last thing to do is just make sure that we can actually link our text boxes together and have real branching dialogue. So done with drawing, and now we need to go to our flip through the pages. So whenever we're done with this text box, we need to create a new one if necessary, and that is so easy to do. So let's go before our instance destroy here. We will say link text for options, and the easiest way for us to determine if we even want to link any text at all is to just say if our option number is greater than 0, then we want to create a new text box. So let's do create text box, and the ID we want to use is this variable over here. If you remember, our option link ID that we always set with our script options. So we'll say option link ID of our option position. And so on the same frame that we're done with this text box, we're getting rid of this one and we're creating a new one that is the response to whatever that actual option was. All in the same frame, so it shouldn't blink out of existence or anything like that. It just carries on. And we're about to find out if what I just said is true. So first, go to your script game text, set up a little conversation like this. To avoid any possible confusion, I would just copy this as closely as you can. You really need to make sure that this right here, these link ID in the script options, you need to make sure that this is the exact same thing as this. No extra spaces, correct capitalization if you're gonna put any in there, all that stuff. It needs to be exactly the same. So let's find out if it works. Okay, so if we say yes, it should give us this answer with just one single exclamation point. Look at that. And if we say no, and look at that. Now you could do some super nested conversations with this, and honestly it is kind of a skill to just get good at keeping this managed in your head and reading it properly. One of the best things you can do for yourself is heavily commenting stuff, and commenting it in ways like this technique here, where you know big different sections start, all that kind of stuff. Keep things really spaced out if you need to, like keep big boy conversations in their own little world. But yeah, so that is the actual branching dialogue part of the system. So just like last time, this is kind of the end of the second section. If anything's going wrong or anything's kind of weird, now's the time to skim back through again. Go back, re-listen to stuff. It's super helpful to re-listen to things, especially once you kind of have all the code already done and you can just look at it line for line. Now, if you've come this far, definitely keep watching, because you've done a lot of work and a lot of setup for some really cool expressive stuff, like different colors for letters, different effects, and an improved way that the text actually wraps around. And so yeah, once you're all ready to go, we can start on our final stretch.